Have you ever wondered how one small decision could completely change the course of your life, and someone else's? What if I told you that a single act of kindness, no matter how small, could set off a chain reaction you'd never see coming? Today, we're diving into a story that proves just that. It's about a rainy night, a desperate stranger, and a choice that leads to love, redemption, and a legacy of hope. Trust me, you won't want to miss this. If you're ready for a tale that will tug at your heartstrings and leave you inspired, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more stories like this. Let's get started. The rain fell in steady sheets, drumming against the cracked pavement of the nearly deserted train station. It was one of those nights that made you feel small, smaller than the flickering fluorescent lights above, smaller than the puddles forming at your feet, smaller even than the weight of your own thoughts. Claire Reynolds tightened her worn-out coat around herself as she sat on a cold metal bench, trying to shield herself from both the biting wind and the suffocating reality of her situation. Claire wasn't used to asking for help, or giving it, for that matter. Life had taught her early on that relying on others only led to disappointment. But tonight, things were different. Tonight, everything hinged on this one chance, an interview tomorrow morning for a job that could finally pull her out of the financial quicksand she'd been sinking in for years. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the crumpled bill inside. $10. That was all she had left. Enough for a ticket home after the interview, if she didn't spend it now. She sighed, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees. The station was eerily quiet except for the rhythmic patter of rain and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Her mind wandered back to the string of bad decisions that had brought her here, the student loans she couldn't pay off, the temp jobs that barely covered rent, the car breaking down last month just when she thought she might be getting ahead. For once, though, she refused to let herself spiral into despair. Tomorrow was a new day, a chance to start over. All she had to do was hold on until then. Just as she was about to check the time again, a figure shuffled into view through the rain-streaked glass doors. He looked rough. His clothes were damp and disheveled, his hair sticking up in odd directions like he hadn't slept properly in days. There was something about him that screamed desperation, but also vulnerability. As he approached, Claire instinctively shifted slightly on the bench, gripping her bag tighter. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice hoarse but surprisingly soft. "I'm sorry to bother you, but, do you have $10? Claire blinked, taken aback by the directness of his request. $10, she echoed, her tone cautious. He nodded quickly, almost frantically. "Yeah. Just $10. I need it to buy a train ticket home. Please." His eyes darted around the empty station before landing back on hers, pleading. They were bloodshot and heavy with exhaustion, but there was something else there too, a raw, unfiltered pain that made her pause. Claire hesitated, glancing down at her pocket again. She knew what handing over that $10 bill would mean. No safety net. No guarantee she'd make it home tomorrow if the interview went south. Yet, despite every logical reason not to, she found herself studying his face, the lines etched deep around his mouth, the way his hands trembled ever so slightly as they clutched the edges of his jacket. "What's your name?" she asked suddenly, surprising even herself. "Ethan," he replied without missing a beat. "Ethan Carter." Claire chewed on her lip, debating silently. Something about Ethan tugged at her conscience. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, like a man who'd hit rock bottom but still held onto a sliver of hope. Or maybe it was simply because she understood what it felt like to be desperate. Whatever it was, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled bill. "Here," she said, holding it out toward him. "Take it." Ethan froze for a moment, staring at the money as if he couldn't believe it. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it, his fingers brushing against hers briefly. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear I'll pay you back. I don't know how yet, but I will." Claire managed a small, uncertain smile. "You don't have to." No, Ethan interrupted firmly, shaking his head. You don't understand. This means more to me than you can imagine. I won't forget this. I promise. Before she could respond, the distant rumble of an approaching train echoed through the station. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, then back at Claire, his expression a mix of gratitude and urgency. I have to go, he said hurriedly. But thank you. Really. And with that, he turned and disappeared into the crowd boarding the train, leaving Claire sitting alone on the bench once again. She watched as the train pulled away, its headlights cutting through the rain like twin beams of salvation. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at her empty hand and wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, or the kindest choice she'd ever known. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it had grown heavier, as if the sky itself were conspiring against Claire Reynolds. She stood under the flickering streetlight at the bus stop, her fingers clutching the empty pocket of her coat where $10 used to be. The bus schedule said the next one would arrive in 15 minutes, but when it finally rolled up with a groan of its brakes, Claire's heart sank. Exact change only, the driver barked through the open window before she could even step aboard. Claire fumbled in her bag, searching desperately for spare coins or anything that might add up to the fare. But there was nothing, just a crumpled receipt from last week's grocery run and an old pen she'd forgotten to throw away. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment as other passengers began to mutter impatiently behind her. I'm sorry, she mumbled, stepping back onto the curb as the bus doors hissed shut. The vehicle lumbered away, leaving her stranded in the cold, drenched rain. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, though it did little to shield her from the biting wind. There was no choice now but to walk. Miles stretched ahead of her, each step feeling heavier than the last. Every car that sped past sent a wave of icy water splashing over her legs, soaking her jeans to the bone. By the time she reached the office building where the interview was supposed to take place, Claire looked less like a hopeful job candidate and more like someone who just survived a hurricane. Her hair clung to her face in soggy strands, her shoes squelched with every movement, and her clothes hung limply on her shivering frame. The receptionist at the front desk barely glanced up when Claire approached. Hi, Claire said, trying to sound confident despite the fact that her voice trembled. I'm here for the marketing position. My name is Claire Reynolds. The woman gave her a once-over, her expression unreadable. Then, without missing a beat, she replied, the interviewer left about 20 minutes ago. He had another meeting to get to. What? Claire asked, her stomach dropping. But I was told the interview was at 9 o'clock. He waited as long as he could, the receptionist said curtly, already turning back to her computer screen. You'll have to reschedule. No, please, Claire pleaded, leaning closer to the desk. I came all this way. I can't, I really need this opportunity. Can you call him? Just give me 5 minutes. I'm sorry, the receptionist said flatly, not bothering to look up again. There's nothing I can do. Defeated, Claire stepped back, her chest tightening with panic. She wanted to argue, to scream, to demand they make an exception, but what good would it do? Instead, she turned and walked out into the rain again, her shoulders slumped under the weight of yet another failure. By the time she trudged home, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic patter of rain against the pavement. When she finally reached her apartment complex, she froze. Standing by the door was Mr. Peterson, her landlord, a wiry man with thinning gray hair and a perpetually unimpressed scowl. Claire, he said, crossing his arms over his chest. We need to talk. Her heart sank. She'd known this moment was coming, she just hadn't expected it tonight. Mr. Peterson, I swear, I'm going to pay you, she started, her voice cracking. I've got a job interview lined up, and once I land it. That's what you said last week, he interrupted, his tone sharp. Rent was due 7 days ago. You're 2 weeks late now, and I've got bills to pay too, sweetheart. I know, Claire said quickly, wringing her hands together. Just give me a few more days. Please. He shook his head, his expression hardening. I can't keep doing this, Claire. You're a nice girl, but business is business. You're evicted. Pack your things and be out by tomorrow morning. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. But, where am I supposed to go? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. That's not my problem, he said, turning to leave. Be out by noon, or I'll have your stuff thrown onto the curb. Claire stood there in stunned silence, the reality of her situation crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Evicted. Homeless. All because she'd given away her last $10 to a stranger. Was that really such a terrible decision? She replayed the night in her mind, the desperation in Ethan's eyes, the promise he'd made to repay her. Had she been foolish to trust him? Or had fate simply decided to punish her for daring to hope? That night, Claire packed what little she owned into a single backpack. There wasn't much, just a few changes of clothes, some toiletries, and a tattered photo album filled with memories she couldn't bear to part with. As she zipped up the bag, tears streamed down her face, mixing with the rainwater still clinging to her skin. With nowhere else to go, she wandered aimlessly until she found herself in a nearby park. The swings swayed gently in the breeze, their chains creaking softly. Claire sat down on a bench, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping her arms around them for warmth. The backpack rested against her side, offering minimal comfort against the chill of the night air. She stared up at the sky, watching the clouds drift lazily across the moonlit expanse. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry, not silently, not holding back, but fully and completely. Each sob tore through her chest, releasing the pent-up frustration, fear, and despair she'd been carrying for so long. When the tears finally subsided, Claire leaned her head back against the bench, staring blankly into the darkness. She felt hollow, like a shell of the person she used to be. Yet somewhere deep inside, buried beneath layers of exhaustion and defeat, a tiny spark of determination flickered to life. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Somehow, she would find a way to rebuild her life, one step at a time. As the world around her slipped into silence, Claire closed her eyes and let sleep claim her, clutching her backpack like a lifeline. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale golden glow across the park. Claire stirred on the bench, her body stiff and aching from the cold night. She blinked groggily, trying to shake off the haze of sleep, or perhaps it was just the lingering exhaustion that had taken root deep within her bones. Her stomach growled loudly, a painful reminder of how long it had been since her last meal. The thought of food made her mouth water, but there was no money in her pocket, no way to buy even the smallest snack. As she sat there, shivering and pulling her coat tighter around herself, an elderly woman approached. Margaret Williams moved slowly, leaning on a cane with one hand while carrying a brown paper bag in the other. Her silver hair was neatly styled under a wide-brimmed hat, and her kind eyes scanned the park with quiet curiosity. When she noticed Claire huddled on the bench, she stopped, tilting her head slightly as if assessing the situation. "You look like you could use this," Margaret said gently, holding out the paper bag. Inside was a simple sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a plain offering, yet impossibly generous given Claire's circumstances. Claire hesitated, her pride warring with her hunger. Accepting charity felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that she couldn't take care of herself anymore. But the gnawing emptiness in her stomach left little room for argument. Finally, she reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against the rough texture of the paper bag. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I really appreciate it." Margaret smiled warmly, lowering herself onto the bench beside Claire. "Don't mention it, dear. We've all been where you are at some point or another, just trying to get by." She paused, studying Claire's face with a mixture of concern and understanding. "If you're looking for help, there's a soup kitchen not far from here. They always need extra hands, especially during busy times. You might find something useful there, maybe even a warm meal." Claire nodded slowly, unwrapping the sandwich with trembling hands. The bread was soft, the filling simple but satisfying. As she took her first bite, tears welled up in her eyes, not just from gratitude, but from the overwhelming weight of everything she'd endured over the past 24 hours. Margaret didn't say anything, she simply sat there, offering silent companionship as Claire ate. When the sandwich was gone, Claire wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked at Margaret. "Thank you," she said again, more firmly this time. "For everything." Margaret patted her knee lightly. "Take care of yourself, sweetheart. And don't lose hope, it has a funny way of showing up when you least expect it." With that, Margaret stood, adjusted her hat, and walked away, leaving Claire alone once more. But this time, she felt a flicker of resolve stirring inside her. If nothing else, she owed it to herself, and to the kindness of strangers like Margaret, to try. Following Margaret's directions, Claire made her way to the soup kitchen. It was housed in a modest brick building tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. A faded sign above the door read Hope's Table in peeling letters, though the name seemed almost too optimistic given the worn state of the exterior. Still, the faint aroma of stew wafting through the air drew Claire closer, her stomach rumbling insistently. Inside, the space was bustling with activity. Volunteers bustled about, ladling steaming bowls of soup and handing out slices of bread to a line of people waiting patiently. At the center of it all stood Carol Stevenson, the manager. She was a stout woman in her 50s with sharp features, a no-nonsense demeanor, and a clipboard perpetually clutched in one hand. Her piercing gaze swept over the room, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Claire approached cautiously, unsure of what to say or how to ask for help. Before she could speak, Carol spotted her and raised an eyebrow. "You lost, honey?" she asked bluntly, her tone neither friendly nor hostile, just practical. "No," Claire replied quickly, shaking her head. I heard you sometimes let people work in exchange for food. Is that true?" Carol studied her for a moment, taking in the disheveled appearance, the tired eyes, and the backpack slung over one shoulder. "We do," she said finally, her voice clipped. "But we don't have time for slackers. If you want to eat, you'll earn it." "I understand," Claire said earnestly. "I'll do whatever you need." Carol nodded once, apparently satisfied with her response. "Fine. Grab an apron from the hook by the door and start clearing tables. Don't make me regret this." Relief washed over Claire as she hurried to grab the apron. For the next hour, she worked tirelessly, wiping down tables, stacking trays, and assisting the cooks whenever they needed an extra pair of hands. Her muscles ached, and her movements were clumsy at first, but she pushed through, determined to prove herself. Eventually, Carol called her over to the serving line. "Here," she said, handing Claire a bowl of hearty vegetable stew and a thick slice of bread. "Eat quick. Then get back to work." Claire thanked her quietly, finding a quiet corner to sit and savor the meal. It wasn't much, but it filled her belly and gave her strength. As she ate, she glanced around the room, observing the faces of those who came seeking refuge. Some looked defeated, others resigned, but a few carried the same spark of determination she now felt burning within herself. When she finished eating, Claire returned to her tasks with renewed energy. By the end of the day, her clothes were stained with grease and her feet throbbed from standing for hours, but she felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't experienced in weeks. Maybe this place, this tiny beacon of hope, could be the start of something new. Over the next few days, Claire returned to Hope's Table every morning without fail. The routine became a lifeline, a way to anchor herself in a world that had felt so chaotic and cruel just weeks before. Each day began the same: she'd arrive early, tie on her apron, and dive into whatever tasks Carol assigned her. Whether it was chopping vegetables in the kitchen, organizing donations in the storeroom, or cleaning up after meals, Claire threw herself into the work with a quiet determination that surprised even herself. At first, the other volunteers barely acknowledged her presence. They were used to seeing new faces come and go, people who showed up once or twice out of desperation but never stayed long enough to make an impact. But Claire wasn't like them. She came back day after day, proving through her actions that she was there to contribute, not just take. Slowly, the others began to notice. It was Jake who broke the ice one afternoon while they were sorting cans in the pantry. A lanky guy in his late 20s with a scruffy beard and a perpetual smirk, Jake leaned against the counter and glanced at Claire as she meticulously stacked cans of soup. "You know," he said casually, "most people don't stick around this long unless they're getting paid." Claire looked up, startled by the comment. I'm not going anywhere," she replied firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "This place, it feels important, you know? Like we're actually helping people." Jake chuckled softly, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, I get that. Been volunteering here for almost a year now. Used to be on the receiving end myself." He gestured toward the scar running along his jawline. "Life knocks you down sometimes. But places like this, they remind you that there's still good in the world." His words struck a chord deep within Claire. For the first time since arriving, she realized she wasn't alone in her struggles. Everyone here carried their own burdens, yet they chose to keep showing up, to keep giving what little they could. It was humbling, and strangely comforting. A few days later, Sam joined their growing circle of camaraderie. Unlike Jake's laid-back demeanor, Sam was all energy and enthusiasm, constantly cracking jokes and teasing anyone within earshot. A former construction worker who'd fallen on hard times after an injury left him unable to perform manual labor, Sam had found solace in volunteering at Hope's table. His optimism was infectious, and soon Claire found herself laughing more than she had in months. The three of them quickly formed a bond, sharing stories over mugs of coffee during breaks and supporting each other through the tougher moments. Jake taught Claire how to efficiently organize supplies, while Sam showed her shortcuts for prepping food in bulk. In return, Claire offered her own insights, drawing from years of temp jobs and odd gigs to streamline processes wherever possible. Together, they became an indispensable team, earning Carol's grudging respect along the way. As the weeks passed, Claire noticed subtle changes in herself. The constant ache of despair that had weighed her down began to lift, replaced by a flicker of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Volunteering gave her something to focus on, a reason to wake up each morning despite the uncertainty of her future. She no longer flinched when someone asked about her past or where she lived. Instead, she spoke openly about her journey, finding strength in vulnerability. Carol, ever observant, took note of Claire's dedication. One Friday afternoon, as the lunch rush wound down, she beckoned Claire into her tiny office tucked behind the serving line. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper files, but Claire didn't mind. She sat nervously on the edge of a chair, wondering if she'd done something wrong. "You've been here nearly 3 weeks now," Carol began, flipping through a clipboard covered in scribbled notes. "And I gotta say, you're one of the hardest workers I've seen in a long time." Claire blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected praise. "Thank you," she murmured, unsure of what else to say. Carol set the clipboard aside and leaned forward, fixing Claire with her trademark no-nonsense stare. "Here's the deal. We're stretched thin as it is, and having someone reliable like you makes a difference. I can't offer much, but starting next week, I'll give you a small stipend. Not enough to live large, but maybe enough to help you get back on your feet." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I mean, I'll take it. Of course, I will. Thank you so much." Carol waved a hand dismissively. "Don't thank me yet. This comes with responsibilities. You slack off, and it's gone. Understand?" Yes, Claire said immediately, nodding emphatically. Absolutely. I won't let you down. When she stepped out of the office, Jake and Sam were waiting for her, curiosity written all over their faces. What did Carol want? Jake asked, raising an eyebrow. She gave me a stipend, Claire admitted, still processing the news. Not much, but it's something. Sam let out a low whistle, clapping her on the shoulder. Well, look at you, climbing the ranks already. Guess we'll have to start calling you boss lady. Despite his teasing tone, Claire could see the genuine pride in his eyes. Jake grinned too, shaking his head. Good for you, Claire. You deserve it. That evening, as Claire walked back to the park where she'd spent her first night homeless, she felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. Hope. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was real. For the first time in ages, she allowed herself to believe that things might actually get better. She settled onto the familiar bench, pulling her coat tighter around herself as the sun dipped below the horizon. Above her, the stars began to twinkle faintly in the darkening sky. Claire tilted her head back, letting the cool night air wash over her. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, of course. But for now, she simply breathed, grateful for the small victories and the kindness of strangers who had reminded her of her own resilience. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Hope's table, casting golden beams across the worn wooden floors. Claire moved methodically between the tables, her hands deftly wiping away crumbs and stray drops of soup with a damp cloth. It was one of those rare days when the kitchen wasn't overwhelmed by chaos, a quiet lull that allowed her to breathe and reflect on how far she'd come since her first day here. She paused for a moment, leaning against the back of a chair as she surveyed the room. The faces of the volunteers, Jake, Sam, Carol, even the regulars who came seeking warmth and sustenance, had become familiar, almost like family. This place had given her more than just food or a stipend, it had given her purpose. For the first time in months, Claire felt grounded, as if the storm clouds that had hovered over her life were finally beginning to part. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door creaking open. A man stepped inside, his silhouette framed by the bright light streaming in from outside. He wore a tailored suit, polished shoes, and carried himself with an air of confidence that seemed out of place in the humble surroundings of the soup kitchen. Claire straightened instinctively, curiosity piqued by the unexpected visitor. And then their eyes met. Time seemed to freeze. The man froze too, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. It took only a second for recognition to dawn. His scruffy beard was gone, replaced by clean-shaven skin, and his once ragged clothes had been traded for designer attire, but there was no mistaking those eyes. Eyes filled with the same raw vulnerability she'd seen that rainy night at the train station. Claire, he said softly, taking a cautious step forward. It was him. Ethan Carter. Claire blinked, unsure whether she was imagining things. Ethan, she replied hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Is that really you? He nodded, a tentative smile spreading across his face. Yeah, it's me. His tone was warm, tinged with disbelief, as though he couldn't quite believe he'd found her either. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Claire simply stared, trying to reconcile the image of the desperate man she'd met weeks ago with the poised, successful figure standing before her now. Finally, she managed to find her voice. You look different. Ethan chuckled nervously, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. I feel different, he admitted. A lot has changed since that night. They stood there awkwardly for a few seconds until Claire gestured toward an empty table. Do you want to sit down? Talk? Relief washed over Ethan's face, and he nodded again. I'd like that. As they settled into chairs across from each other, Ethan began to explain. After that night at the train station, I went home, to my parents' house. I hadn't spoken to them in years, not since I dropped out of college and started spiraling downward. But something about what happened that night, your kindness, giving me that $10 when you clearly needed it more than I did, it woke me up. Made me realize how much I'd let myself fall apart. Claire listened intently, her expression softening as he spoke. She'd wondered so many times whether handing over her last bit of money had been the right decision. Hearing Ethan talk now, seeing the transformation in him, confirmed what she'd hoped all along, that small acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. I got my life together, Ethan continued, his voice steady but tinged with gratitude. Started working again, saved some money, and eventually landed a job at a tech startup. Things are good now. Better than good. That's amazing, Claire said sincerely, offering him a small smile. I'm really happy for you. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. But none of it would have happened without you. That $10 wasn't just money, it was hope. You gave me hope when I didn't think I deserved it. Claire shook her head, brushing off his praise. It wasn't about deserving anything. You looked like you needed help, and I could give it. That's all. Ethan studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $10 bill. He slid it across the table toward her. Here. To pay you back. Claire glanced at the bill, then back at Ethan, amusement tugging at the corners of her mouth. You don't owe me anything, she said lightly. Besides, it was never about the money. Ethan smiled, his eyes crinkling at the edges. I know. That's why I want to do more. What do you mean? Claire asked, tilting her head slightly. Ethan sat back, folding his hands together. When I got back on my feet, I promised myself I'd find you. I wanted to repay you, not just for the money, but for everything you gave me that night. Hope, faith, a second chance. So, I started looking. Checked shelters, hospitals, even put up flyers around town. But I couldn't find you anywhere. Claire frowned, touched by the lengths he'd gone to. I was staying at a park for a while. Moved around a lot. I can see that, Ethan said with a wry grin. Anyway, when I walked in here today and saw you, he trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. I couldn't believe it. Like fate brought us back together. Claire laughed softly, the sound carrying a mix of disbelief and wonder. Fate doesn't usually work this way for me. Well, maybe it's making an exception, Ethan replied, his tone teasing but sincere. Because I meant what I said, I want to do more. Not just for you, but for places like this. He gestured around the room, taking in the bustling volunteers and grateful patrons. This is important work. And if I can help support it, I will. Claire felt a lump rise in her throat, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. Ethan, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, he interrupted gently. But I want to. You showed me what it means to give without expecting anything in return. Now it's my turn. As they sat there, surrounded by the hum of activity in the soup kitchen, Claire realized something profound. Sometimes, the smallest gestures, like giving away your last $10, could spark a chain reaction of change. Change not just in others, but in yourself. And perhaps, just perhaps, her journey wasn't over yet. The conversation between Claire and Ethan continued, the air thick with emotion as they sat across from each other at the small table in Hope's table. Outside, the afternoon light began to soften, casting long shadows across the room. The hum of activity around them faded into the background as Ethan leaned forward, his expression serious now. There's something else I need to tell you, he said, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. Something I should have told you that night at the train station, but couldn't. Claire raised an eyebrow, curiosity mixing with a hint of apprehension. What is it? Ethan took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. My name isn't just Ethan Carter. I'm the CEO of Carter Tech. And I founded the Carter Foundation, a nonprofit focused on addressing homelessness and poverty. Claire blinked, her mind struggling to process his words. She studied him carefully, the expensive suit, the polished demeanor, and suddenly it clicked. Of course. How hadn't she seen it before? But still, disbelief lingered. Wait, she said slowly. You're that Ethan Carter? He nodded, offering a sheepish smile. Yeah. That's me. But, Claire shook her head, trying to reconcile the man sitting before her with the scruffy, desperate stranger she'd met weeks ago. Why were you at the train station that night? Why did you look like you needed help? Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair as he stared off into the distance, lost in thought. It's complicated, he admitted. I'd been working on a project for the foundation, trying to understand homelessness firsthand. So, I went undercover. No wallet, no phone, nothing. Just, living on the streets for a week to see what it was really like. Claire's eyes widened in surprise. You were pretending? Not entirely, Ethan corrected gently. I wasn't faking being hungry or cold or scared. Those feelings were real enough. But yes, I had planned to end the experiment after a few days. Only, he paused, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. Things didn't go according to plan. My wallet got stolen early on, along with my ID and any way to prove who I was. By the time I met you, I was genuinely stuck. Desperate. He looked at her then, his gaze intense and filled with gratitude. And then you came along. You gave me your last $10 when you clearly needed it more than I did. You didn't ask questions, didn't judge me, you just helped. No one else that night even looked at me twice. But you reminded me why I started this work in the first place. Claire felt her cheeks flush, unsure how to respond. I didn't know any of that, she murmured. I just saw someone who needed help. And that's exactly why I'm here today, Ethan said firmly, leaning forward again. Because of who you are. Because of the compassion you showed, not just to me, but to everyone here at Hope's table. Claire, I want to offer you a job. At the foundation. For a moment, Claire thought she'd misheard him. A job, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. You're joking, right? I've never been more serious, Ethan replied, his tone unwavering. We're expanding our outreach programs, and we need people who truly understand the challenges faced by those experiencing homelessness. People like you. Claire shook her head, panic rising in her chest. Ethan, I can't, I don't have experience. I don't have a degree. Hell, I don't even have a stable place to live. What could I possibly offer your foundation? Ethan reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over hers. Let me stop you right there, he said gently. We hire people with MBAs and decades of corporate experience. We also hire people who've lived in tents and eaten out of soup kitchens. What matters isn't where you've been, it's where you're going. And Claire, you have heart. Real, genuine heart. That's something no amount of education or training can teach. His words struck a chord deep within her, stirring emotions she hadn't let herself feel in years. Hope. Belief. Maybe even trust. Still, doubt lingered. But what would I even do? She asked hesitantly. I don't know anything about running a foundation. You wouldn't be alone, Ethan assured her. We'll train you, support you every step of the way. Start small, help organize events, assist with fundraising campaigns, maybe even share your story to inspire others. Over time, you'll grow into the role. Trust me, Claire, you're exactly the kind of person we need. Claire sat there, her mind racing as she weighed his offer. It sounded too good to be true, a lifeline thrown to her when she least expected it. Yet, looking into Ethan's earnest eyes, she realized he meant every word. This wasn't charity, it was opportunity. An opportunity to turn her pain into purpose, her struggles into strength. Finally, she exhaled, a small but determined smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll do it." Ethan grinned, relief and excitement lighting up his face. "You won't regret it, I promise." Later that evening, as Claire walked back to the park bench where she'd spent so many nights, she couldn't stop smiling. The weight of uncertainty still lingered. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in months, she felt a sense of direction. A glimmer of possibility. She settled onto the bench, staring up at the stars twinkling faintly in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring changes, big ones. But tonight, she simply allowed herself to dream. To imagine a future where she wasn't defined by her past, but empowered by it. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Claire believed she might actually get there. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity for Claire Reynolds. Her life, which had once felt like a series of misfortunes strung together by sheer willpower, was now taking on a rhythm she hadn't experienced in years. Each morning, she woke up not on a park bench or in some borrowed corner of the world, but in her own small apartment, a modest one-bedroom unit provided temporarily through the Carter Foundation's Housing Assistance Program. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And for the first time in months, she had a place to call home. Her new job at the foundation kept her busy from sunup to sundown. On her first day, Ethan introduced her to the team during a staff meeting held in a bright, airy conference room filled with motivational posters and whiteboards covered in colorful notes. The other employees greeted her warmly, their enthusiasm infectious. Some were seasoned professionals with degrees in social work or nonprofit management. Others, like Claire, came from less traditional backgrounds but shared a deep passion for helping those in need. "You'll start slow," Ethan reassured her afterward, as they walked back to her desk. "We'll ease you into things, no pressure." True to his word, Claire's initial responsibilities were simple yet meaningful. She began by shadowing coordinators who oversaw various programs, accompanying them on site visits to shelters, food banks, and community centers. At first, she felt out of place, unsure of how to contribute beyond observing quietly. But as the days turned into weeks, she started finding her footing. One afternoon, while shadowing Sarah, the head of outreach, Claire found herself standing in front of a group of volunteers at a local shelter. Sarah had asked her to share her story, to explain why she cared so deeply about this work. Claire hesitated at first, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. But as she looked around the room at the faces staring back at her, she realized something important: these people weren't judging her. They wanted to understand. To connect. So, she spoke. She talked about losing her job, being evicted, sleeping on park benches, and finally finding hope again at Hope's table. Her voice trembled at times, but she pushed through, determined to be honest. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Several volunteers approached her afterward, thanking her for sharing her experiences and telling her how inspiring they found her resilience. That moment marked a turning point for Claire. For so long, she'd seen her struggles as weaknesses, as failures that defined her. But now, she began to see them differently. They weren't just obstacles, they were lessons. Lessons that gave her unique insight into the challenges faced by the very people the foundation aimed to help. As part of her training, Claire also dove into learning about grant writing, fundraising strategies, and event planning. These tasks were far outside her comfort zone, but she tackled them with determination. Late nights spent poring over budgets and proposal drafts became routine, though she didn't mind. Every completed task felt like another step forward, another brick laid in the foundation of her new life. Ethan checked in with her regularly, offering guidance and encouragement whenever she doubted herself. "You're doing great," he told her during one of their weekly meetings. "Better than great, actually. I knew you'd shine here." Claire smiled, though she still struggled to fully believe him. "I'm trying," she admitted. "But sometimes it feels like I'm faking it until I make it, you know?" Ethan chuckled softly. Welcome to adulthood. Everyone's winging it half the time. The key is to keep moving forward, even when you feel like you're stumbling." His words stuck with her, becoming a kind of mantra she repeated to herself whenever self-doubt crept in. Slowly but surely, her confidence grew. She began speaking up more in meetings, suggesting ideas for new initiatives and volunteering to take on additional responsibilities. Her colleagues noticed the change too, often praising her creativity and dedication. Outside of work, Claire's personal life began to stabilize as well. With steady income and a roof over her head, she was able to focus on rebuilding other aspects of her life. She reconnected with old friends she'd lost touch with during her darkest days, apologizing for disappearing and explaining where she'd been. To her surprise, most of them welcomed her back with open arms, eager to support her as she moved forward. She also made time for herself, for hobbies and interests she'd abandoned in the chaos of survival. On weekends, she explored the city, visiting museums, parks, and coffee shops she'd never had the energy, or money, to enjoy before. Sometimes, she brought Jake and Sam along, introducing them to her new world and marveling at how far she'd come since their days scrubbing tables at Hope's table. By the end of her first month at the foundation, Claire stood on the balcony of her apartment, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. The air smelled crisp and clean, carrying with it the promise of fresh starts. She thought about everything that had led her here, the hardships, the kindness of strangers, the risks she'd taken, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life wasn't perfect. There were still challenges ahead, moments when doubt would creep in and remind her of how fragile progress could be. But for now, she chose to focus on the present. On the fact that she was no longer defined by her past mistakes or her lowest points. Instead, she was building something new, something better. As the stars began to twinkle faintly in the darkening sky, Claire whispered a quiet thank you to the universe. For hope. For second chances. And for the reminder that even in the darkest storms, light could find its way through. Claire's journey at the Carter Foundation had been nothing short of transformative. Each day brought new challenges, new lessons, and a growing sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. But it wasn't until one crisp autumn morning that Ethan handed her an opportunity so profound it would change not only her life but countless others. "You've earned this," Ethan said as he slid a folder across her desk. His tone was warm yet serious, his eyes gleaming with pride. "Your first big project." Claire froze, staring at the folder as if it might suddenly sprout wings and fly away. My first big project," she stammered, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Are you sure?" "I mean, I'm still learning." "And you're doing great," Ethan interrupted firmly, cutting off her protest before it could gain momentum. "This is exactly why I want you to take this on. You've got perspective, real, lived experience, that none of us can fake. That matters more than any textbook knowledge." Curiosity finally outweighing her hesitation, Claire opened the folder. Inside were notes outlining a bold idea, a mobile soup kitchen initiative designed to bring food directly to those in need, rather than waiting for them to come to traditional shelters or kitchens. The concept was simple but revolutionary, a way to meet people where they were, both physically and emotionally. "This," Claire began, flipping through the pages slowly, her mind racing with possibilities. "This is incredible. But why me? There are people here who know so much more about logistics and planning than I do." Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on her desk. "Because this isn't just about logistics. It's about understanding what it feels like to be hungry, cold, and too proud, or too ashamed, to ask for help. You remember what that's like, don't you?" Claire nodded, her throat tightening as memories flooded back. She remembered standing outside that bus stop, drenched and defeated, unable to scrape together enough change for a ride home. She remembered sitting on park benches, clutching her backpack like a lifeline, too afraid to admit how desperate she truly was. And she remembered walking into Hope's table for the first time, feeling like the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. "I do," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I remember every second of it." "Exactly," Ethan said, his expression softening. "That's why you're perfect for this. You'll design something that doesn't just feed people, it restores their dignity. Their hope." The responsibility felt enormous, almost overwhelming. Yet, deep down, Claire knew she couldn't turn it down. This was her chance to give back, not just to the foundation that had given her a second chance, but to all the people out there who were struggling just as she once had. Over the next several weeks, Claire poured her heart and soul into the project. She spent hours researching existing mobile outreach programs, studying their successes and shortcomings. She visited shelters, parks, and abandoned buildings where people experiencing homelessness often congregated, listening intently to their stories and concerns. What did they need most? How could the initiative best serve them without making them feel like charity cases? Her ideas began to take shape. The mobile soup kitchen wouldn't just offer meals, it would provide resources, clothing, hygiene kits, information about housing assistance programs, even mental health counseling referrals. Most importantly, it would operate on a schedule, visiting specific neighborhoods at consistent times so people could rely on its presence. When it came time to present her proposal to the board, Claire was a bundle of nerves. She stood in front of the conference room, clutching her notes tightly as a dozen sets of eyes focused on her. For a moment, she considered stepping aside, letting someone more experienced handle the pitch. But then she remembered Ethan's words, "You have heart. Real, genuine heart, *." Taking a deep breath, she began. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies fluttering in her stomach, "this isn't just about feeding people. It's about reaching them where they are, literally and figuratively. Too many individuals facing homelessness avoid shelters because they feel judged, embarrassed, or unsafe. Our goal is to eliminate those barriers by bringing help directly to them." She went on to explain the logistics, the custom-designed van equipped with refrigeration units, storage compartments, and folding tables for serving. The partnerships with local restaurants and grocery stores to minimize costs. The volunteer training program aimed at fostering empathy and respect. By the time she finished, the room was silent, a silence that quickly erupted into applause. "Well done," said one of the board members, a woman named Patricia, as she rose from her seat. "This is exactly the kind of innovation we need." Approved. Relief washed over Claire like a tidal wave. She turned to Ethan, who gave her a thumbs up and a grin so wide it lit up the entire room. "Told you," he mouthed silently. In the months that followed, Claire worked tirelessly to bring the project to life. She coordinated with contractors to retrofit the van, collaborated with chefs to develop nutritious meal plans, and recruited volunteers eager to make a difference. Every detail mattered, every decision carrying the weight of her vision. Finally, the day arrived. The Open Hands project launched with a ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by foundation staff, volunteers, and members of the community. The sleek white van gleamed in the sunlight, its sides emblazoned with the project's logo, two hands cradling a steaming bowl of soup. As Claire stood beside Ethan, watching the first group of volunteers climb aboard, she felt a swell of pride unlike anything she'd ever known. "This is your legacy," Ethan said quietly, nudging her shoulder. "Something you built from scratch. Something that will save lives." Claire smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Not just mine," she replied softly. "Ours." As the van pulled away, heading toward its first destination, Claire thought about all the people it would touch, the ones who might see it as a lifeline, a reminder that they weren't alone. She thought about Margaret, Jake, Sam, Carol, and everyone else who had helped her along the way. And she thought about herself, the version of herself who had sat shivering on a park bench, wondering if things would ever get better. They had. Against all odds, they had. And now, she was paying it forward, one meal, one story, one act of kindness at a time. The autumn air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and freshly baked goods wafting from nearby food trucks. Claire stood at the edge of a bustling community event hosted by the Carter Foundation to celebrate the success of the Open Hands project. The atmosphere buzzed with energy, children laughing as they chased each other around inflatable bounce houses, volunteers handing out free meals from the mobile van, and local musicians strumming guitars on a makeshift stage. Claire had spent most of the afternoon mingling with attendees, sharing stories about the project and thanking donors for their support. It was rewarding work, but also exhausting. As she stepped away from the crowd for a moment of quiet, her eyes landed on a familiar face across the field. Margaret Williams. The elderly woman stood near one of the food stalls, chatting animatedly with a group of volunteers while clutching a paper plate piled high with macaroni salad and barbecue chicken. Her wide-brimmed hat shaded her face, but there was no mistaking that warm, grandmotherly smile. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen Margaret since that fateful morning in the park, the morning when a simple sandwich had changed everything. Without thinking twice, she made her way over, weaving through clusters of people until she reached the older woman. "Margaret?" Claire said softly, tapping her gently on the shoulder. Margaret turned, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Well, if it isn't Claire Reynolds," she exclaimed, pulling her into a tight hug. "Look at you, all grown up and doing such wonderful things." Claire laughed, feeling a lump rise in her throat. I wanted to thank you," she said earnestly, her voice trembling slightly. "For that day in the park. For the sandwich, and for telling me about Hope's table. I don't know what I would have done without your help." Margaret chuckled, waving off her gratitude with a dismissive hand. "Oh, sweetheart, don't mention it. You were meant to find your way there. I just gave you a little nudge." "A nudge?" Claire repeated, tilting her head quizzically. Something about Margaret's tone suggested there was more to the story than met the eye. Margaret smiled knowingly, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Let's just say I had a hunch about where life might take you after that day." "What do you mean?" Claire asked, confusion knitting her brow. Margaret glanced around briefly, ensuring no one was listening before leaning in conspiratorially. "Ethan is my son," she revealed, her voice low but filled with pride. Claire froze, her mind reeling as the words sank in. "Wait. Ethan is your son," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew who I was? That I was the girl who helped him?" Margaret nodded, her smile widening. "Of course I did. When Ethan came home that night, he couldn't stop talking about you, the kind stranger who gave him her last $10 even though she clearly needed it more. He was so moved by your generosity. And then, when I saw you sitting on that bench weeks later," she paused, shrugging lightly. "I figured fate had brought us together for a reason." Claire stared at her, stunned. All this time, she'd thought her encounter with Margaret had been pure coincidence, a stroke of luck in an otherwise bleak period of her life. But now, she realized it had been anything but random. Margaret had known exactly who she was sending to Hope's table. "Why didn't you tell me?" Claire finally managed to ask, her voice tinged with disbelief. Margaret patted her arm affectionately. "Because sometimes, dear, people need to discover things for themselves. If I'd told you who Ethan was, or why I sent you to the soup kitchen, you might not have believed in yourself as much as you should have. You needed to see how far your own strength and kindness could carry you." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes, spilling over despite her efforts to blink them away. She felt overwhelmed, not just by Margaret's words, but by the realization that every step of her journey had been guided by unseen hands. Hands that had pushed her toward hope, resilience, and redemption. "I don't know what to say," Claire admitted, shaking her head slowly. "Thank you doesn't feel like enough." "You don't owe me anything," Margaret replied warmly, squeezing her hand. "You're the one who made all of this possible. My son included." They stood there for a moment, surrounded by the hum of laughter and music, two women bound by shared experiences and unspoken understanding. Claire looked out over the crowd, watching as volunteers served meals, families played games, and strangers exchanged smiles. This was her legacy, the culmination of choices both big and small, acts of kindness rippling outward like waves on a still pond. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon in hues of orange and pink, Claire turned back to Margaret. "Do you think we ever really understand how our actions affect others?" she asked quietly. Margaret considered the question for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "Probably not," she said finally. "But maybe that's the beauty of it. Sometimes, the smallest gestures, the ones we don't even think twice about, end up changing lives in ways we can't imagine." Claire nodded, letting the truth of those words settle deep within her chest. She thought about the $10 bill she'd handed to Ethan that rainy night, the sandwich Margaret had given her in return, and the countless other moments that had led her here. Each act of kindness had been a thread, weaving together a tapestry far greater than any one person could have created alone. And now, standing beside the woman whose son she'd once helped, and who had unknowingly helped her in return, Claire felt a profound sense of connection. To Margaret. To Ethan. To everyone whose lives had intersected with hers along the way. "Thank you," Claire whispered again, this time with a smile. "For everything." Margaret simply winked, her expression mischievous yet full of love. "Just promise me one thing, dear." "Anything," Claire said immediately. "Keep paying it forward," Margaret replied, gesturing toward the bustling crowd around them. "Because you never know who might be waiting for their miracle." The success of the Open Hands project had become a beacon of hope for the community, and for Claire herself. Each day brought new challenges, but also victories that reminded her why she'd poured her heart into this work. The mobile soup kitchen wasn't just feeding people, it was building connections, restoring dignity, and planting seeds of change in ways Claire could never have imagined. But as fulfilling as the project was, there was another element of her life quietly blossoming alongside it, one she hadn't anticipated. Over the weeks, Claire and Ethan had grown closer, their professional partnership evolving into something deeper. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, late-night brainstorming sessions over steaming cups of coffee, shared laughter during stressful moments, and long conversations about everything from childhood memories to dreams for the future. One evening, after yet another marathon meeting at the Foundation's headquarters, Claire found herself sitting across from Ethan in the dimly lit conference room. Papers were scattered across the table between them, remnants of budget reports and logistical plans they'd been reviewing. Outside, the city lights twinkled through the rain-streaked windows, casting soft reflections on the polished wooden surface. "You know," Ethan said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them, "I don't think I've ever worked with anyone who understands this mission as deeply as you do." Claire looked up from her notes, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "That's because I've lived it," she replied softly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Not just seen it from the outside." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Exactly. And that makes all the difference." He paused, leaning back in his chair and studying her intently. "You've changed so much since we first met. Not just professionally, but personally too." Claire raised an eyebrow, amused. "Is that your way of saying I used to look like a drowned rat?" Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "No, though you did make quite the entrance that night." His tone softened, growing earnest. "I mean, you've grown into someone incredible. Someone strong, compassionate, fearless. Watching you take ownership of this project has been inspiring." Heat rose to Claire's cheeks, and she quickly looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. Compliments still felt unfamiliar, even now. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or your mom, for that matter." "Yeah, Mom has a knack for nudging people in the right direction," Ethan agreed, grinning. Then, after a beat, he added, "But you're selling yourself short. You've always had this fire inside you, it just needed the right opportunity to shine. Claire glanced up, meeting his gaze. There was something in his eyes, something warm and steady, that made her pulse quicken. She cleared her throat, trying to shake off the sudden rush of emotion. Well, thanks. I guess. They sat there for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken words. Finally, Ethan broke the spell by standing and stretching. We should call it a night, he said, glancing at his watch. It's getting late. Claire nodded, gathering her papers and stuffing them into her bag. As they walked out of the building together, the cool night air hit them, carrying with it the faint scent of autumn leaves. Streetlights cast golden pools of light onto the sidewalk, and the distant hum of traffic provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation. I'll walk you home, Ethan offered casually, falling into step beside her. You don't have to, Claire protested half-heartedly, though secretly she didn't mind the company. It's not safe to walk alone this late, he countered, his tone teasing but firm. Besides, I need to stretch my legs after being cooped up in that conference room all day. They strolled side by side, their footsteps echoing softly against the pavement. For a while, neither spoke, content to simply enjoy the quiet camaraderie. But as they approached Claire's apartment building, Ethan hesitated, stopping just short of the entrance. Claire, he began, his voice hesitant, there's something I've been wanting to say. She turned to face him, her heart skipping a beat. What is it? He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair nervously. This past year, working with you, getting to know you, it's been amazing. More than amazing, actually. You've become someone really important to me. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, he trailed off, searching for the right words. Claire waited, her breath catching in her throat. She'd suspected, of course, felt the shift in their relationship over the past few months, but hearing him put it into words sent a jolt of electricity through her. I care about you, Ethan finished finally, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. A lot. And I don't want to keep pretending otherwise. Tears pricked at the corners of Claire's eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. Ethan, she started, her voice trembling. I feel the same way. I just didn't think that I'd feel the same, he interrupted gently, stepping closer. Claire, you've been changing my life since the moment I met you. That hasn't stopped, not once. Before she could respond, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Then, slowly, he leaned in and kissed her, a soft, tender touch that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. When he pulled back, his forehead rested lightly against hers, his breathing uneven. I'm glad, Claire whispered, smiling through her tears. Because I don't think I could stop caring about you if I tried. In the weeks that followed, their bond deepened, blending seamlessly into both their personal and professional lives. They continued to work tirelessly on the Open Hands project, but now their late-night meetings often ended with shared meals or walks under the stars. Their connection became a source of strength, grounding them even during the busiest, most chaotic days. Margaret noticed the change immediately when she visited the foundation one afternoon. Well, she teased, watching as Ethan handed Claire a cup of coffee with a grin. Looks like my matchmaking skills are still sharp. Claire laughed, blushing furiously. You're impossible. And you two are perfect for each other, Margaret replied, her tone affectionate. Don't let anything, or anyone, get in the way of that. As winter approached, blanketing the city in a soft layer of snow, Claire found herself reflecting on how far she'd come. From the cold, lonely nights on park benches to the warmth of Ethan's embrace, her journey had been nothing short of miraculous. She no longer saw herself as the girl who'd lost everything. Instead, she was the woman who'd rebuilt her life, one act of kindness, one leap of faith, at a time. And as she stood on her apartment balcony, watching the snowflakes dance in the moonlight, she knew one thing for certain: love and growth weren't destinations, they were journeys. And she was ready to keep moving forward, hand in hand with the man who'd helped her find her way. The crisp winter air carried a sense of anticipation as Claire stepped into the Carter Foundation headquarters one chilly morning. It had been nearly a year since she'd started working there, and every day felt like another step forward, not just for her personally, but for the countless lives touched by the Foundation's initiatives. The success of the Open Hands project had grown beyond anyone's expectations, expanding to multiple cities and earning recognition from national organizations. Yet, despite the accolades and milestones, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. When Ethan called her into his office later that afternoon, she assumed it was just another strategy meeting. She knocked lightly on the doorframe before stepping inside, finding him seated behind his desk with an unreadable expression on his face. Papers were spread out in front of him, including what looked like a formal letter bearing the logo of a prestigious nonprofit network. "Hey," she said, forcing a smile. "What's up?" Ethan gestured for her to sit, his fingers tapping nervously against the edge of the desk. "Close the door," he said quietly. Claire did as he asked, her curiosity morphing into concern. "Is everything okay?" she asked, taking a seat across from him. He hesitated for a moment, then exhaled deeply. "I got an offer," he began, pushing the letter toward her. "They want me to head up the expansion of the Carter Foundation to New York." Claire stared at the document, her mind racing. New York? That was hundreds of miles away, a completely different chapter, not just for Ethan, but potentially for them both. She swallowed hard, trying to process the weight of his words. "That's incredible," she managed finally, though her voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "This is such a huge opportunity for you, and for the Foundation." "It is," Ethan agreed, leaning forward earnestly. "But it's also a decision I can't make without talking to you first." Claire blinked, caught off guard. "Me? Why me?" "Because you're part of this," he replied simply, his gaze unwavering. "Not just professionally, but personally. I don't want to do anything that would jeopardize what we've built together." Her heart clenched at the sincerity in his voice. Over the past few months, their relationship had become the anchor in her life, the one constant amidst the chaos of growth and change. But now, faced with the reality of distance, doubt crept in. Could they really sustain what they had if separated by so many miles? Claire faltered, looking down at her hands. "I love my work here. This city, these people, they're my home now. I've poured everything I have into making a difference right where I am. Leaving feels impossible." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I get that," he said softly. "And I wouldn't ask you to give that up. Your roots here are important, just like mine are tied to this foundation." "But," Claire trailed off, searching for the right words. "What does that mean for us? For whatever this is between us?" Ethan stood and walked around the desk, crouching beside her chair so they were eye level. Taking her hands in his, he spoke with quiet conviction. "We're not bound by location, Claire. We're bound by what we believe in, by the values that brought us together in the first place. If we let those guide us, then distance doesn't matter." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes, spilling over despite her efforts to hold them back. "It sounds so simple when you say it like that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But long-distance relationships are hard. What if we lose each other along the way?" "We won't," Ethan insisted firmly, brushing away a tear with his thumb. "Not if we fight for it. Not if we trust each other. And not if we remember why we fell in love in the first place." His words struck a chord deep within her, reminding her of all the moments that had defined their journey, the late-night conversations, the shared laughter, the unspoken promises they'd made to support each other no matter what. She realized then that love wasn't about convenience or proximity, it was about choice. About deciding, every single day, to show up for someone, even when it wasn't easy. "You're sure about this?" she asked finally, her voice steadier now. "About going to New York?" Yes, Ethan replied without hesitation. But only if you're okay with us doing this, together, even apart. Claire took a deep breath, letting the enormity of the decision settle over her. Then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, she said softly. Let's try. Let's see where this takes us. Ethan smiled, relief washing over his face as he pulled her into a tight embrace. Thank you, he murmured against her hair. For believing in us. In me. In the weeks that followed, preparations for Ethan's move dominated their days. They spent hours discussing logistics, how often they'd visit each other, how they'd stay connected, and how they'd navigate the inevitable challenges of being apart. Despite the looming uncertainty, there was also excitement, a shared belief that their love could withstand anything life threw their way. On the night before Ethan's departure, they stood together on Claire's apartment balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, melting as soon as they touched the ground. This isn't goodbye, Ethan said softly, wrapping his arms around her from behind. It's just, see you soon. Claire leaned into his embrace, closing her eyes as she memorized the warmth of his touch. See you soon, she echoed, her voice filled with quiet determination. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, they made silent promises to themselves and to each other, to communicate openly, to prioritize their connection, and to never take each other for granted. Love, they realized, wasn't about avoiding challenges, it was about facing them together, no matter the distance. When the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Claire watched Ethan drive away, her heart heavy yet hopeful. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew one thing for certain, their bond was stronger than any obstacle. And as long as they held on to that truth, they'd find their way back to each other, again and again. The past year had been a whirlwind of growth, challenges, and triumphs for Claire Reynolds. What had started as a small mobile soup kitchen initiative, born out of her own experiences with hardship, had blossomed into the Open Hands Project, a nationwide network of support centers dedicated to helping individuals experiencing homelessness rebuild their lives. From coast to coast, the project offered not just meals but housing assistance, job training programs, mental health resources, and more. Claire herself had risen through the ranks at the Carter Foundation, earning the role of director for the flagship homeless support center in her city. Her leadership style was empathetic yet firm, rooted in the belief that everyone deserved dignity and opportunity. Under her guidance, the center became a beacon of hope, a place where people weren't defined by their struggles but empowered to overcome them. But despite her professional success, there was one part of her life that remained bittersweet, Ethan's absence. Over the months, they'd stayed connected through daily calls, video chats, and occasional visits. Yet, no matter how much effort they put into maintaining their relationship, the distance between New York and her hometown weighed heavily on both of them. Still, they clung to the promises they'd made, to trust each other, to prioritize their connection, and to never lose sight of why they'd fallen in love. It was a crisp spring evening when the foundation hosted a gala to celebrate the one-year anniversary of the Open Hands Project. The event was held in a grand ballroom adorned with twinkling fairy lights and elegant floral arrangements. Volunteers, donors, and community members gathered to honor the program's impact, sharing stories of transformation and gratitude. Claire stood near the stage, dressed in a simple yet striking navy blue dress, watching as people mingled and laughed under the glow of chandeliers. As the night wore on, she found herself reflecting on how far she'd come since that rainy night at the train station, the night when she'd handed over her last $10 to a stranger named Ethan Carter. That single act of kindness had set off a chain reaction, leading her here, to a life filled with purpose, fulfillment, and love. She smiled softly, wondering if fate truly existed or if it was simply the power of human connection that had brought her to this moment. "Excuse me, miss," a familiar voice said behind her, pulling her from her thoughts. "Do you have a moment?" Claire turned, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Ethan standing there. He looked the same, polished suit, confident posture, but there was something different about him tonight. Something softer, warmer. His eyes sparkled with emotion as he stepped closer, holding out a single red rose. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here? I thought you couldn't make it." "I wouldn't miss this for the world," he replied, his tone laced with affection. "Not after everything you've accomplished." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes as she accepted the rose, her hands shaking slightly. I didn't think you'd be able to surprise me like this." "Well," he said with a grin, "consider it my specialty." For a moment, they simply stood there, soaking in the presence of each other. Then Ethan gestured toward an empty corner of the room. "Can we talk for a minute? Privately?" Claire nodded, following him away from the crowd until they reached a quiet alcove near the windows. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the night sky, casting a soft glow over the space. Ethan turned to face her, his expression serious yet tender. "Claire," he began, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a weathered $10 bill. It was creased and worn, its edges frayed with age, but unmistakably the same bill she'd given him a year ago. "This changed my life. Not because of its value, but because of what it represented. You gave me something money can't buy, faith when I had nothing. Belief when I couldn't believe in myself." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "And now, I want to spend the rest of my life proving you were right about me. About us." With that, Ethan dropped to one knee, holding the $10 bill between two fingers like a sacred token. Around them, guests began to notice, murmuring excitedly as they realized what was happening. But Claire barely registered the attention, her entire focus was on Ethan, her heart pounding in her chest. "Claire Reynolds," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion thickening it, "will you marry me?" Time seemed to freeze. Claire stared at him, tears streaming down her face as the weight of his words sank in. This man, the same man who had once been a desperate stranger at a train station, was now offering her a future built on the same foundation of trust, resilience, and unconditional love that had carried them through the hardest moments of their journey. "Yes," she whispered finally, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, of course." Ethan exhaled sharply, relief washing over his face as he stood and pulled her into a tight embrace. Cheers erupted from the crowd around them, but Claire barely heard them. All she could feel was the warmth of Ethan's arms, the steadiness of his heartbeat, and the overwhelming certainty that she'd made the right choice. Later that night, as the gala wound down and the guests began to leave, Claire and Ethan found themselves alone on the balcony overlooking the city. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming flowers. They stood side by side, fingers intertwined, watching as the lights of the skyline reflected off the river below. "You know," Claire said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder, "I never thought that $10 would bring me here." "Neither did I," Ethan admitted, chuckling lightly. "But I guess that's the thing about kindness, it ripples outward in ways we can't always predict." Claire nodded, smiling as she thought about all the lives they'd touched together. "Do you remember what your mom said to me? About how sometimes the smallest gestures end up changing lives?" "How could I forget?" Ethan replied, squeezing her hand gently. "She was talking about you, you know. About the way you see the best in people, even when they can't see it themselves." They fell silent for a moment, content to simply exist in each other's presence. Finally, Claire tilted her head back, meeting Ethan's gaze with a look of pure gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For believing in me. For coming back. For being exactly who you are." Ethan kissed her forehead, his lips lingering for a moment. "No, Claire. Thank you. For giving me a second chance. For teaching me what it means to truly care. And for saying yes tonight." As they stood there beneath the stars, surrounded by the hum of the city and the promise of a shared future, Claire felt a profound sense of peace. Life hadn't been easy, not for either of them, but every challenge had led them here. To this moment. To each other. And as long as they faced the world together, she knew they could handle anything it threw their way. Every great story leaves us with something, a spark of inspiration, a lesson that lingers long after the final chapter. This one is no different. At its core, Claire and Ethan's journey reminds us of a simple yet profound truth: kindness has power. Not just to change someone else's life, but to transform our own. Claire began her story at rock bottom, stripped of everything she thought defined her. Yet in her darkest moment, she chose to give what little she had left, a $10 bill. That act wasn't just charity, it was courage. It was faith. And it set off a chain reaction neither she nor Ethan could have predicted. From homelessness to hope, from despair to love, their lives became intertwined through one small decision to care when it would have been easier not to. So, what can we take away from this? First, never underestimate the ripple effect of your actions. A single moment of compassion, whether it's helping a stranger, lending an ear, or simply smiling at someone having a bad day, can create opportunities for connection, healing, and growth. You may never know the full impact of your kindness, but trust that it matters. Second, don't let fear hold you back from doing good. Claire didn't know Ethan. She didn't know if he'd use her money wisely, or even repay her. But she acted anyway, choosing to believe in the possibility of goodness over the risk of disappointment. Life rewards those who dare to trust, to hope, to extend themselves beyond their comfort zones. And finally, remember this: resilience isn't about avoiding hardship, it's about finding meaning in it. Claire rebuilt her life not by forgetting her struggles but by using them as fuel to help others. Her pain became purpose. Yours can too. Now, here's where you come in. Stories like Claire and Ethan's are all around us, waiting to be told. They remind us of our shared humanity and inspire us to be better versions of ourselves. If this story resonated with you, if it made you reflect on your own capacity for kindness, we invite you to join us for more. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next inspiring tale. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that even the smallest acts of goodwill can move mountains. Together, let's build a community rooted in empathy, encouragement, and action. Because every story matters, including yours. What will your act of kindness be today? Start now. The world is waiting.